Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Martin Andrews, Communications Director at inquirED. Welcome to our webinar, The Case for Elementary Social Studies, Civic Life in the Era of Truth Decay. I will be introducing Shanti Elangovan here in a second, inquirED's founder and CEO, and she's going to be hosting today, and she'll introduce you to our panelists. And when she does, I'll head over into the chat. So if you have questions, you can share them there and I'll pass them along to our panelists. Also, after we finished here today on Friday morning, to be exact, you'll receive an email from me with a link to a blog post. That'll include a summary of the content we've discussed, including any resources that are mentioned. So don't worry about copying down websites or anything like that. I will include all of that in the blog post and a video recording of the webinar, so you can share that out with others. The email will also include a link to request a certificate of attendance for those of you who would like one of those. For those of you just joining us, welcome. And let's find out a little bit about who we have in the audience today. So I'm going to launch a poll. And just so you know, Zoom only gives me 10 options. So if you do not fit into one of these categories, put it in the chat for us and let us know who is out there today. Are you an elementary teacher, a middle school teacher, a high school teacher, an instructional coach, librarian, administrator? Are you in higher ed or from an ed organization? Are you a curriculum developer or writer? Please let us know who's out there today, and I'll share the poll with you here in a second. All right, we have quite a few middle school teachers and administrators, lots of people from ed organizations. So whoever you are out there today, thank you for coming, and I hope that you will get something out of the presentation today. This webinar series is brought to you by the National Council for the Social Studies and inquirED. The National Council of the Social Studies was founded in 1921. It's the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to the social studies. NCSS engages and supports educators in strengthening and advocating for the social studies. They have a really important event coming up. They've been a lead supporter and partner in the development of Educating for American Democracy, an initiative that promises a greater emphasis on civic and history education that's powerful, interdisciplinary, and inquiry-based. How great that they're doing that, and it's very aligned to what we're talking to you about today. Also, the series is brought to you by inquirED. inquirED has created Inquiry Journeys, our elementary social studies curriculum, to move students and teachers beyond the textbook, supporting culturally responsive teaching, inquiry-based learning. It is standards aligned and it contains high quality, diverse sources. And I think it's a once-a-day remedy for truth decay. I'm sorry, I had to make that pun. Okay, I also want to announce one thing is that we have a whole new webinar series that was just released today, and we're calling it Searching for Social Studies. And you can go to inquired.org/webinars, and you can read the list of webinars that we have, all free and all around the topic of defining what high quality instructional materials in the social studies are, and looking at how districts and schools are going out and finding those. We'll have representatives from the Carnegie Corporation. We'll have NCSS President Stephanie Wager on with us. And we will be looking at our own curriculum rubric to see if we can figure out what makes high quality instructional materials for the social studies. I am going to stop my video now and welcome on, actually I'll stop my share, and I will welcome on Shanti. Hey Shanti, how are you?
Good. How are you, Martin?
Good. Well, I'm going to let you take over and introduce our guests, and I'll head into the chat.
Thanks, Martin. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. I am honored to be here with two fantastic panelists. Julie and Laura, do you want to turn on your cameras? And I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists today. So Julia Kaufman is a senior policy researcher and co-director of the American Educator Panels at RAND. Her research focuses on the policies and programs states and schools could undertake to ensure high quality teaching and learning. She's led numerous projects focused on understanding K-12 curriculum and instruction across the US, including a study on how teachers are addressing student civic development, the American Instructional Resources Survey study, and an investigation of teaching and learning during COVID-19. Her research has been published in numerous academic journals and RAND reports. She holds a PhD in international education from New York University and an MA in teaching from the University of Pittsburgh. Julia, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Now I've got to move over to introduce Laura. Laura Hamilton is General Manager of the Research Centers at Educational Testing Services, otherwise known as ETS, where she leads a portfolio of research on assessment and learning related to K-12 and post-secondary education and workforce development. Prior to joining ETS, she served as a distinguished chair in learning and assessment, directed the RAND Center for Social and Emotional Learning Research, and co-directed the American Educator Panels. Much of her research is focused on promoting effective use of assessment data to support social, emotional, and academic learning, and in providing evidence-based guidance to local and state education leaders. She has also explored how civic education can contribute to a more equitable and informed society. She holds a PhD in educational psychology and an MS in statistics from Stanford University. Laura, thank you so much for being here today. Oh, you're on mute, Laura.
I thought I'd get further into it before I did that. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we're very excited to hear from you all about the work that you've been doing really around this very important subject of truth decay, and something that we spend a lot of our time at inquirED talking about. So, and I know our attendees today are eager to hear from you all. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off and turn it both over to you, and you can start screen sharing. And for our guests, what we'll do is Laura and Julia will present for a bit, and then I'll do a little Q&A with them, and then we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. So as they're going, please feel free to go ahead and start adding questions into the audience Q&A, and then we'll circle back to those at the end. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Well, we are very excited to be here, Julia and I both, and it's even more exciting to see all the educators in the group. I really enjoyed getting a sense of the different roles of the people who've joined this call. I'm sure many of you, like us, attended yesterday's Educating for American Democracy Forum and have been paying attention to the growing emphasis on civics and education policy debates. The work we'll present today is intended to add to the knowledge base by providing some systematic data summarizing the perspectives of one group, K-12 public school social studies teachers, who will play a crucial role in helping improve civic life in the United States. The research was described in a report that RAND released in December, and we'll be happy to share the link to that report after the session. So you can move on to the next one, Julia. So here's a little overview of what we'll talk about today. There'll be plenty of time for discussion. We'll first describe the concept of truth decay and its connection to civics. We'll briefly discuss our approach to understanding how schools across the US are promoting civic learning. We'll share a few findings, and then we'll talk a bit about where we should go from here. So next one. So first, let's talk about what we mean by truth decay. Let me go to the next one, Julia. So truth decay can be defined as the diminishing role that facts, data, and analysis play in our political and civil discourse and in the policymaking process. The initial RAND work on truth decay was published in a 2018 book by Jennifer Kavanaugh and Michael Rich, who is RAND's CEO. And RAND has continued to engage in research on various aspects of truth decay. Kavanaugh and Rich described truth decay as comprising 4 specific trends that you see here. So increasing disagreement about facts and data. This is exemplified by the skepticism we've seen around the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Blurring the line between opinion and fact. Increasing volume and influence of opinion over fact. And we see this partly because there's so much opinion and commentary out there now, so it's harder to find the facts. And then finally, declining trust in institutions that can serve as sources of facts, like the media and government. So we end up with a situation in which people don't know what is true and what is not true, or where to look to make that determination. So why are we seeing these trends? Part of the problem is the explosion of false information all around us. Disinformation like that surrounding vaccines is amplified in volume, speed, and scope in our current information ecosystem. You've almost certainly experienced this sense of information overload yourselves, And if you talk with students about where they're getting information, it's clear that the sources have proliferated in ways that aren't always conducive to informed debate. There's a second factor, which is the cognitive biases that we all have. These are systemic errors in thinking that occur when we process and interpret information. Social media and the algorithms that determine what information we see online exacerbate these pre-existing biases by feeding us information that aligns with them and failing to show us information that contradicts them. And then, of course, disinformation is fueled by partisanship and polarization, something that was on clear display on January 6th. Let's go next. So what can schools do about all of this? So as you heard from the bios, Julia and I both have worked in education for a long time, and we became interested in this topic after reading the other Rand work on truth decay. Much of that work focused on how adults navigate the news media and interpret different sources of information. Given our interest and background in education, we saw a clear connection with what schools can do. Recent work on civics education has provided a framework to help us think about the connection between schools and truth decay. You can see this in the definition of civic learning, that we're talking about a lot more than knowledge of facts and concepts related to topics like government, which is how people often interpret civics when they first hear the word. Civic learning also includes skills such as the ability to engage with others and use one's voice through reading, writing, speaking, and listening, application of research and critical thinking skills, media literacy, and evaluating the personal, community, and institutional impacts of one's actions. Civic dispositions include important competencies such as identifying personal, cultural, and linguistic assets of others, demonstrating personal and collective agency, identifying diverse social norms, including unjust ones, and having a sense of civic duty and concern for the welfare of others. So as this broad definition makes clear, the responsibility and opportunity for promoting civic learning extend well beyond the social studies classroom. So recognizing this breadth, civic educators and scholars have identified a variety of ways that schools can promote civic learning. This list of 10 promising practices illustrates this variety. They include activities that occur within a classroom, so possibly social studies, but potentially other subjects as well. And they also include school-wide efforts like extracurricular activities that promote collaboration or efforts to improve the school-wide climate. Let's go next. So now we'll say a bit about how we documented civic learning opportunities in schools across the US. Given the breadth of activities I just shared, a single study can't fully capture everything schools are doing. So we decided to focus on one group, social studies teachers, who have primary responsibility for civic learning and who can provide a window into related activities happening in their schools. So I'll just give you a little brief overview of our methods for this research. We used Rand's American Teacher Panel, which provides nationally representative samples of teachers across the US to administer a survey to social studies teachers. We included those who reported teaching social studies, even if they also taught other subjects. The majority of our elementary teachers in particular taught social studies in addition to several other subjects, as is typical at the elementary level. Our sample included all grade levels, and the schools varied in size, student composition, and geographic location. So we're able to look at inequities in resources and learning opportunities across different types of schools. The survey results we provide in this presentation and in our report are weighted to be nationally representative. Okay. So because we wanted to understand not just what teachers were doing, but the conditions that either supported or hindered their efforts, we drew on prior research regarding factors that influence teaching and learning. This framework you see here shows the basic categories of conditions that we examined. The 3 boxes on the left include factors that are related to teaching and that in some but not all cases are outside the direct control of teachers. We show civics-related practices in the middle, and then the framework shows that these practices are intended to improve students' civic behaviors and outcomes. We don't have much data on student outcomes. Julia will talk a little bit more about how we measured some of those. Next. So our survey produced a ton of findings, many of which are described in the report. For today, we're going to focus on just a few, and we'll give you some samples from each of those boxes in the framework. So I will start by sharing some data on teachers' reported practices, that box in the middle. Okay, so there's a lot on this slide. I'll just mention a few highlights. The red bars show the percentages of secondary social studies teachers, so that's middle and high school, who said that they placed either a moderate or major emphasis on each of these activities listed here. The blue bars show the same information for elementary teachers. So we see that elementary teachers were less likely than secondary teachers to engage in civic-specific activities, but more likely to emphasize social and emotional learning and conflict resolution, which can, of course, contribute to civic learning. The findings suggest opportunities for elementary teachers to engage in more civics-focused activities, such as discussions of current events. And they can do this by incorporating these topics into other activities like morning meetings, which are widely used in SEL settings, or into academic instruction in English language arts, math, or science. So that was a very quick overview of what we found on practices. And again, you can read a lot more in our report. I want to move now to a quick summary of some results related to teachers' beliefs about civics and their preparation to address it. So this is one of the sets of factors that can influence how teachers are able to promote civic learning. Next one. So here are just a few findings related to this category. Almost 2/3 of secondary teachers and 39% of elementary teachers described civic development as an absolutely essential priority. Most of the rest said it was important, but not essential. This suggests a need to support teachers who aren't currently prioritizing it, perhaps because of too many other demands. Julia will talk a bit more about these demands. Second, a lot of teachers reported receiving no training to teach civic knowledge, skills, or dispositions. The elementary teacher results aren't too surprising since most of them teach multiple subjects, but the numbers are concerning and suggest a need for more pre-service and in-service learning opportunities for teachers. Finally, the differences we saw based on teacher race and ethnicity are noteworthy. Teachers of color reported more emphasis on several civics topics, as you can see here. These findings, along with other research evidence, point to the clear value of a diverse teacher workforce. So now I'll turn it over to Julia, who will present some additional findings and describe our next steps.
Thank you very much, Laura. So Laura got into the civic education practices that teachers report engaging in. She talked a little bit about teacher beliefs and preparation and the role that they might play in civic instruction. And so now I'm going to talk about instructional materials and assessments. And as Shanti pointed out, we don't have a lot of research base in regard to the civics education instructional materials that teachers use in the classroom. We know a lot more in the areas of English language arts, math, and science. In fact, RAND does a lot of research on use of instructional materials in these areas. So the survey that we fielded to social studies teachers kind of touches the tip of the iceberg in order to understand what teachers are using in their classroom. So this is a figure right out of our report, and we asked teachers what materials they use for their classroom instruction to address civics and social studies. So you can see here that the trends for elementary and secondary teachers are somewhat similar, but one thing that stood out to us is that majorities of teachers say that they rely on materials they found themselves for civics and social studies for about half or more of their lessons. So they're bringing in a lot of materials that they found. They're also creating a fair number of materials from scratch, but they also have materials provided by their school or district that they use as well. So they're bringing in materials from a lot of different sources. And what this suggests to us is that teachers will bring in materials that probably strengthen their civics education lessons, but we don't know. We don't really know the quality of materials that teachers find themselves and what that means for what they do in the classroom, where we have a little bit more knowledge of what teachers are doing when they're bringing in their own materials provided by their school or district. In addition, we asked teachers what they thought about their school and district provided instructional materials. About half of the respondents indicated that they have a major or moderate need for better instructional materials to teach civics, and the need was higher at the elementary level. Another major need that teachers reported were instructional resources that are culturally relevant, as well as resources to help meet the needs of students with IEPs or 504 plans. So as you can see, we think that there are a lot of unmet needs among teachers in terms of the instructional materials that they need to address diverse student populations and provide good, high quality civics instruction. Now I'm going to touch just a little on some of our findings related to the context in which teachers teach. We asked them about the obstacles they face to addressing civics education in the classroom. And we also asked them a number of other questions about their standards and other areas that we don't address in this particular presentation. In terms of obstacles, the one huge trend was that elementary teachers cited pressure to cover other content as a major obstacle to civic education. So 54% of elementary teachers said that that pressure was the biggest thing that was a major obstacle to keeping them from addressing civic education. There were other obstacles in terms of lack of flexibility in the curriculum, disciplinary problems, lack of support, but that pressure to cover other content was definitely one that stood out, particularly for elementary teachers. Secondary teachers reported that there were other obstacles as well as for example, low levels of student interest and engagement, whereas elementary teachers reported that less. But you can see here that there are a number of obstacles that teachers face when they are thinking about how to address civics education in the classroom. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about student behaviors and outcomes. We didn't include a long list of questions in our survey about the kinds of civic behaviors that students are exhibiting in classrooms. We weren't sure that we would get valid responses from all teachers about what they're seeing among students, but we did ask at least some questions about student behaviors that could reflect a need for civic education. So we asked a number of questions about students' challenges in using social media and their media literacy. So the bars here represent the number of times that teachers have observed those behaviors among students in the past month. So you can see here substantive proportions of teachers at both the elementary and the secondary level indicated that their students have made unfounded claims in class at least once in the last month. Another one that stood out for us was that over half of secondary teachers indicated students share hateful posts on social media at least once in the past month. There were other flags, red flags, in regard to the kinds of behaviors that teachers are engaging in that suggest that they need more media literacy support in the classroom, but those are two of the bigger highlights. We also asked teachers to tell us whether particular students received negative remarks or derogatory behavior that they observed more than 3 times in the past month. So you can see here that students who express particular political views, about close to 20% of secondary teachers said that those students were the object of negative remarks or behavior multiple times in the past month. You can see for all these categories, this happened less at the elementary level than the secondary level, which is perhaps unsurprising, but still about 10 to 15% of teachers said they observed negative behaviors towards certain student groups at least, multiple times in the past month for all of the groups that you see here on this figure. So lastly, I'm just going to touch on some of the relationships that we observed between what school and classroom civic education practices teachers reported engaging in the classroom and the other things we measured in our survey. Of course, this is just one survey, and we can only look at correlations. We can't assess whether any of these things are causing teachers to address civic education more in the classroom, but we can look at relationships, and we can know if teachers who address these civic education practices more have, for example, received more training or use their instructional materials in particular ways. So one thing we looked at was the relationship between teachers who say they received training in civic education and the extent to which they address civic education approaches and topics and address civic education skills in the classroom. So we found a really convincing, strong relationship between teachers' reports of the preparation and training they received and what they do in the classroom. Specifically, teachers who said they received no pre-service or in-service training, and as Laura pointed out, that's quite a few teachers, about half of elementary teachers and about a third of secondary teachers of social studies. Those teachers who said they received no training were far less likely to say that they emphasize particular civic education instructional approaches or skills in the classroom. So that was one big trend we found. Another big trend we found was a relationship between teachers who reported that they used materials they found themselves in their lessons and how much they address civics instructional approaches. So actually, we thought perhaps we would see that when teachers brought in materials they found themselves, they may be addressing civic education practices less because they were bringing in these materials from the outside, and we don't know the extent to which they address the range of practices we asked about. But we actually found the opposite. Teachers who said that they found more instructional materials and assessments for addressing civic education were more likely to say that they address certain civic education practices in the classroom. And I guess this makes sense because teachers who are going out there taking the initiative, finding materials, perhaps because their textbooks and materials that the school provides have drawbacks that they want to address, those teachers are addressing instructional approaches related to civic education like current events, controversial issues, and media literacy more so than other teachers. Lastly, we did find some relationships between the context in which teachers are teaching and the obstacles that they report. Interestingly, again, in teachers that perceived more obstacles to addressing civics in the classroom were actually more likely to address a number of civic skills we asked about in our survey. Again, this suggests to us that teachers who see more obstacles also see more opportunities to teach civics. And so that might be one reason for the civic education trends that we saw there. So lastly, I'm going to summarize some of our recommendations and where we suggest that the field focuses. First, of course, changes to policy and funding could support more robust and equitable civic learning. First, mechanisms for monitoring equity and access to high quality civic learning opportunities. One thing we didn't talk a lot about today, but for sure we saw, was that teachers in schools with higher poverty and more students of diverse ethnicities were less likely to address many of the civic education approaches and topics we asked about. We need to know in detail and for specific schools how much teachers are able to bring in civics education so that we know where there are deficits and how much teachers are addressing civic education topics in the classroom. We also know that state education standards in terms of social studies vary quite a bit across states. For example, only 14 states that we knew of as recently as January 2020 had media literacy education requirements, and only 14 states require a civics exam. Although we know that in states with civics exams or civics standardized tests, the teachers tend to spend more time on civics. So if we could strengthen state standards and accountability policies around civic education, we may see teachers addressing civics topics and approaches more. Additionally, as Laura mentioned, we saw that teachers of color were more likely to address a range of civic education topics we asked about. And so we recommend that teacher pipeline programs seek to bring in a diverse candidate pool and bring them into the classroom so that they can share all those diverse perspectives with students. Additionally, our research pointed to many supports that teachers need. First, pre-service and in-service training. The fact that so many elementary teachers, about 50%, reported receiving no pre-service or in-service training on students' civic development really points out a need to us for more of pre-service and in-service training. So teacher preparation programs can play a role here, but also school districts can play a role by bringing in more training to help teachers be able to address civic education topics. Our research pointed out that teachers lack the instructional materials they need to meet the needs of all students. We also saw that many elementary teachers reported needs to address math and English as an obstacle to addressing civic education. One recommendation that we have come up with to address this issue is guidance for integrating civic learning with learning in other academic subjects. If civic learning was integrated with English and mathematics, perhaps elementary teachers at least would be able to address civic education more so in the classroom. And of course, greater curriculum flexibility could help with this as well. Lastly, teachers can't do it all. How can states foster great partnerships with organizations that can supplement school-based civic learning, help students engage in civic education both in and outside the classroom? So that brings this presentation to an end. I have not been monitoring the chat, so I'm going to end the show so that I can.
Julia, do you mind actually leaving your deck up for a second?
Oh, sure. No
Yeah,
problem.
I just wanted to jump into some questions, and it might be helpful for some of these questions to refer to some slides.
Yep.
Thank you both Julia and Laura for that. You know, you weren't seeing the chat, but people were talking about just the importance of the data that you all are presenting, and people eager to get the entire report. And so just to reshare with everyone, we'll make sure to share that in the blog post that goes out on Friday. I want to jump, if you don't mind, if you could jump to the slide that you were talking about in terms of student behaviors. I think it was in, yeah, that looks like it, 22.
Or perhaps this one.
Yes, that one is the right one. Yep. If you don't mind going to present mode. So
Yep.
Thank you so much. So, you know, you've presented this data, and I think it often somebody can walk away and say, wow, this is a real challenge we're having at the secondary level. And, you know, elementary, yeah, it's happening, but nowhere near on the scale that it's happening at secondary. And what you're showing here is really thinking about what hateful social media posts, just to have everybody kind of look at this slide and really see what the data is showing here. As a former elementary teacher and somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about elementary social studies, I'm inclined to say that I think there's a large part due to what we're seeing in terms of at secondary is the lack of civic education at the elementary level. And so I'm just wondering if you can respond to that, because I think we've just seen over the last 20 years just a huge marginalization of social studies. And I can't tell you how many times when I started a social studies organization, people said, social studies, really, for elementary? And I'm glad that it's starting to change, but I don't think it's fully changed. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I'll let Laura take on the bulk of this question, but as you all know who are on the call, if you're serving students at the elementary level, if you're a parent, students spend a ton of time dealing with and negotiating media literacy information. And so it's at this period that they really need all the supports that will help them and foster the kinds of behaviors that we want to see at the secondary level. I know that Laura has thought a lot about this too, so I'm wondering if she wants to add a few points.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think, you know, we've seen, just as one example, the age at which children typically get some kind of a smartphone or other device that allows them access to the internet has, you know, declined consistently over time. And so you see a lot more elementary kids who are, you know, just, you know, getting devices, learning how to kind of navigate the information ecosystem, and perhaps not getting a whole lot of guidance on that. So I think it's absolutely right that there's a need for this in elementary school. There are also, as we talked about in the presentation, there are lots of opportunities. You know, we've seen a big shift toward an emphasis on social and emotional learning, and that's been probably greater at the elementary level than at the secondary level. And there's a ton of overlap between civics and SEL. It's one of the reasons I kind of got interested in this topic. So, you know, many of the programs that are designed to support social and interpersonal competencies will simultaneously build the kinds of competencies that promote, you know, effective civic engagement. So I do think there are opportunities to do this. And at the same time, there are, you know, as you point out, lots and lots of pressures on elementary teachers to work in other things into their limited day. And that's the last thing I'll say about that is I think it's the ability to integrate these civic concepts into other subjects, not just social studies, is also really helpful. So teaching quantitative literacy through math, teaching some of those civic concepts overlap nicely with ELA, writing, reading, speaking skills.
Yeah. Feel free to turn your screen share off now, Julia. Thanks for letting me direct you a bit there. Just thought it'd be easier to ask that question with that. I think that all of what you're talking about, Laura and Julia, there in terms of thinking about elementary and the marginalization and how it needs to start there, I think kind of really connects to my next question that really digs into thinking about instructional materials. So you noted that elementary teachers that find their own materials are more likely to emphasize civic approaches. And again, I think we are all in agreement that there's just a lack of materials out there, of high quality instructional materials, especially at the elementary level. And so you're seeing teachers go out and find their own materials, and you saw that they were more likely to emphasize civic approaches. But we're hearing more and more about the challenges of unvetted resources like those found on Teachers Pay Teachers. I often say, you know, it's interesting because I very rarely hear about teachers writing their own ELA curriculum or math curriculum, and yet you see very few disinformation or misinformation pieces out there that say 2 + 2 = 5. And yet we see that every day in everything we do in social studies. And so I just want to hit on this point and see if you can talk a little bit, just kind of going beyond kind of that finding and really thinking about what the complexities around that.
Yeah, so at RAND, we've been studying use of curriculum for a long time, but not in social studies. We've looked at it in English language arts, in math, in science. One of the more robust findings from that area is that teachers bring a lot of materials into their classroom instruction. They use Teachers Pay Teachers to a large degree, way larger than we thought when we first sent out surveys, you know, like large proportions, more than 50% of teachers report using Teachers Pay Teachers, many on a regular basis. And so I'm not saying that Teachers Pay Teachers doesn't include some good resources, but the point remains that we don't really have any way of vetting those materials for how they address civic education in a robust way. And there are all these ways in which we know that civic education can be provided to students that scholars have pointed out are important things to address, like controversial events, like current events, like media literacy. And we have no idea the extent to which various instructional materials address those things. In math and in English language arts, and now a little bit more in science, we actually have reviews of instructional materials by groups like Ed Reports. Now, of course, Ed Reports doesn't look at everything about those instructional materials, really focuses a lot on the topics that they address, and there are many other ways to review instructional materials. But if we had some more robust reviews of materials in social studies, that might guide teachers towards materials that would be most useful to use in the classroom. And at the elementary level in particular, we know very little about the kinds of materials that teachers are bringing into their classroom lessons.
Julia or Laura, before I turn to you, I just want to really reiterate how much we agree there in terms of the instructional materials. We, as curriculum providers ourselves, we want someone to hold our feet to the fire. Like, say what it looks like. Tell us what it needs to look like and really say, are you doing this? Because otherwise we've got a wild, wild west and just saying, hey, teachers, we're pointing the finger at them and saying, you've done something wrong here. You pulled in this resource, and then saying it without any training, without any materials, and saying, well, it was your fault. Why did you do that? So I just want to really put in a plug for our next webinar series that is all about the need for high quality instructional materials in social studies, especially at the elementary level, but really across social studies. So for our attendees, please share that webinar series out and please plan on attending. We'll really dig into that topic. So thanks for taking us there, Julia. But Laura, I want to give you a chance to respond on that end as well.
No, so Julie is our resident expert on instructional materials and all subjects, so I think she answered it really well. The one of the findings that came out of our survey was around the need for materials to engage students, and one of the barriers that came up was, you know, students' lack of interest in social studies, and so I do think that's an area where I think helping teachers understand how they can promote civics through active, engaging activities and not just through textbooks is something that teachers are saying they want help with, and that you know, there are a lot of resources out there that can contribute to that. So yeah. I think that's a particular area of need, and we don't know, but that may be one reason why teachers are going external, because they're finding the textbooks that they have inadequate.
Yeah, thank you. I want to turn to some of the questions in the audience Q&A because they're hitting on similar topics. We have a question asking, would civics education standards come from the federal government, or would they be left to the states to create the standards? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, that's quite a contentious issue, but you know, it is a state decision what standards to address in the classroom. I think that many have perceived some states as adopting federal standards, but that's not what happens. Typically, there are standards that states make a decision to adopt. So it is the state's role to determine that. But, one of the dangers of that is that what can happen is that states can have social studies standards that look very different across the United States. And I think there is a little bit more conformity happening, with C3 standards being taken on by lots of states. And conformity can be a good thing because then you know that students in one state are getting similar kinds of skills and knowledge as students from another state. But I think a lot of states have to step up their game, addressing things like media literacy in a really much more robust way. RAND just put out a series of media literacy standards that address the truth decay kinds of trends that Laura noted. And I think that those kinds of standards need to be integrated into all states' social studies standards, and that it would be good to produce more documentation on how social studies standards across the United States differ, especially given the growing consensus that civic education includes so many things beyond what traditional social studies standards typically address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then having assessments, and they don't have to be high stakes assessments, but some way of sort of monitoring progress toward the standards that are actually aligned with them, as well as sources of curriculum materials that are aligned with those standards. So putting out the standards by themselves, one of the things we saw in our data is that a lot of teachers in states that had standards didn't know they had them. So if you put the standards out by themselves without those additional instructional supports and access to data that will help them track student progress, then they're unlikely to have an effect.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat around what constitutes a list of what constitutes civic education. And so I'm just curious if either of you kind of want to go there in terms of thinking about, because I think it connects to this question of standards and what we're trying to say. And I think generally people think, oh, it's the civics government class I took in 8th grade kind of idea. And I wonder if both of you could speak, either of you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, so we had a slide near the beginning that kind of laid out very brief definitions of civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions. And those, and in our report, we have some more elaborated definitions for each of those 3 categories. And that's not something Julie and I came up with. That is, those are definitions that have been around for a while. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, for example, had some convenings years ago, 10 years ago. There was one in 2011, I think, that pulled experts together to come up with those definitions. So actually go back one previous, Julia. And so yeah, so this is kind of, and you can see, and if you look at our report, you can actually see these references and go look at them to get some more information. But what you can see from this is that civics actually encompasses a huge number of different, skills, dispositions, areas of knowledge that overlap quite a bit, both with social and emotional learning and to some degree with some academic subjects. And then the next slide that you originally had up is sort of, again, a kind of a consensus view about the activities that schools can engage in that would promote civic learning. So when we talk about civic education, all of these things that are on this slide could potentially be part of that. So it doesn't just have to be what's happening in social studies class.
Yeah, and I would just add there that I think there is, in many school systems, there's probably a pretty big disconnect between what many social studies and civic education scholars are recommending be addressed in schools and what is addressed. I think a lot of times school systems are still providing social studies instruction in topics, civics, government, history, law, economics, and are not really thinking broadly across all these other issues. And so if there is a way to kind of start to bridge the gap and begin to help school systems think about the range of civic education activities that could be addressed in classrooms, I think that that's a good thing.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat of, in elementary classrooms where math, literacy, intervention time take about 75% of the day, how do you suggest embedding civic education into other content areas outside of social studies?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So if you just think about the civic skills that are related to media and information literacy, there's lots you can do in a math class around, understanding graphs, reading data, understanding, basic scientific method. And when you're trying to interpret information about vaccines is going back to that example. How do you judge the source of that information and the quality of the evidence underlying it? So that, you can kind of go down that route with math and science and the STEM areas. The next generation science standards actually have a lot of overlap with some of these civic skills. And then in English language arts, a lot of the work that teachers often do with their students around understanding, cultures through reading novels, developing those interpersonal skills, writing, all of that has, potential applications to civics. And so I think what's needed is, lesson plans and, again, instructional materials to kind of support that integration, so that teachers aren't having to figure it out for themselves and figure out how to make their existing math or ELA curriculum fit with the need to address civics.
Yeah, and I think that English language arts and maths standards have begun to catch up with the idea of the need for integration across the United States. There's more and more focus on nonfiction texts in standards, and you can, use that as an opportunity to bring in social studies texts. But one of the things that we have definitely seen is that instructional materials broadly in those areas, English language arts and math, have not yet caught up with what's emphasized in most state standards. And so we need more of those materials that integrate the full range of civics education topics and skills that are now addressed in most state education standards for ELA and for math and for science.
Yeah, I think what you're hitting on too is really thinking about, while we might think like, okay, how do we take this content and put it in other subject areas? I might challenge us to say, how do we really put the time in that's needed for social studies? Because we've also seen that a move away from social studies has not improved in reading. Like spending 2 hours a day on reading and writing is not improving reading and writing. That students need background knowledge, that students need robust time for social studies. So I think we almost have to turn our thinking a bit, that content really matters, and we've got to think about what that looks like.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I do feel like the pandemic right now is putting a lot more focus on math and reading than perhaps there was before, right? We know because of assessments when students are falling behind in those areas. We have no idea what's happening in civics education right now. And we suspect that math and English language arts are more the focus of instruction right now when students aren't getting as much instruction, generally many students who are virtual. And so what's going to happen in the future, we can't necessarily just narrow our focus in math and reading for the next couple of years, right? We need to actually probably broaden our focus and make sure to bring back those subjects that students may not have gotten enough of.
Yeah.
And Shanti, I think I think a previous webinar in this series looked at this study by, I think it was Fordham Institute.
We did.
Yeah.
I think it was our first webinar in this series, actually looking specifically at the study that Fordham did.
Yeah, so they, finding that if you teach social studies, it helps kids learn to read.
Exactly. And I think that, we don't take, this is, I'm sure, something that most everyone agrees that is attending this webinar. And so I'm saying it preaching to the choir, but we don't like to take a long-term approach in education. Sometimes we try to think about the short term, like what is the effect that it's having right now today. And I think your slide really just in terms of the behaviors really shows that we've got to take a long-term approach to things. We can't think that all of a sudden when students get into 10th grade, we're going to teach them something that has them understand like how to use social media or how to use these tools that are very powerful tools. And, we don't give a teenager a car without saying, hey, let's take some time to really understand how to drive this car. So we got to take a longer term approach about thinking about those things. Yeah. So let me skip, there's still more in the chat. So I want to spend the last few minutes going there. Did you see any connection between schools that actively encourage and positively practice civics, like robust student media programs that embrace First Amendment principles and free speech for students, or have active voter registration, and student civic engagement? It's one thing to teach it and another to defend students as they use it.
We did not measure a lot of those constructs that this person asked about, like civic engagement. We didn't ask teachers about student civic engagement. We did ask them about the extent to which their school, not just they themselves, were addressing many civic education approaches. But I really fear that that data doesn't reflect the deep and rich work that many schools are doing. You know, a teacher would just say, yes, my school's doing this, my school's emphasizing this to a major degree. So we couldn't look closely at the relationships between that and civic engagement. I don't know if Laura wants to add anything else to that.
No, I think that's right. It's there's a robust research agenda that could follow from the report that we did, and lots of questions that still need to be answered. So I hope others will jump on that.
Yeah. There's a question about reporting the, I think they're asking about the media literacy standards. So, and just sharing that link as well. So Martin will be sure to share that, put a note in to share that as well in the blog post on Friday, because those standards are also incredibly important. I want to end today with just thinking about a little bit about where the work is going. I know the topic of truth decay is important for both RAND and ETS. So I wonder if both of you could just take a few moments to speak to us a little bit about where you see this work going from here.
Yeah, I'll start. And I actually, I'm hopeful that RAND and ETS can collaborate more in this area. So I'm very interested in the kinds of things that ETS is thinking about right now, but I'll just give some highlights on some of the things that RAND is thinking about. We developed these media literacy standards, and I think the next step is trying to understand how they might be used productively in states and school systems. We actually just recently got some internal funding for some researchers to explore use of these standards in particular school systems. And so that's very exciting. But I think we also need to just make sure that those media literacy standards are on the minds of folks as the civic education agenda moves forward. We know that there is a civic education bill that's going to be raised in Congress, hopefully this spring, and we've seen it and are excited about it. And we think it can add more focus and funding to civic education if it's approved. And so we've been thinking a lot about the ways in which research can contribute to that agenda more robustly, really, for example, by understanding the extent to which instructional materials supports teachers' civic education, and whether, you know, there is of course some value in teachers bringing in some of their own experiences and materials, but how can they use those alongside materials that we know address the approaches and topics that are important. So we'll be looking at that. In addition, RAND is broadly thinking about how to measure civic infrastructure and strong civic infrastructure in communities, including strong aspects of civic education. And so that's kind of a larger project, but it'll help us think more about what it means to have a strong civic infrastructure and how education could support that.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, and you know, I too am hoping to keep collaborating with RAND. I've been away from RAND for about 5 months now at ETS and enjoying the new job, but missing my colleagues there. And I think we have a lot of complementary expertise. So, you know, ETS is known for being an assessment company. We are doing a lot of work now to kind of shift more into the learning area. So kind of thinking about how assessment and learning tools can reinforce one another. And we've also been doing a lot of work on digital assessment and learning and innovations in that area. And so one of the challenges with tracking student civic learning is that if you think back to that long list of skills and dispositions, a lot of those are really hard to measure with traditional paper and pencil or even computer-based sort of multiple choice tests, the kinds of tests that are often used for large scale assessment. And so, so there's a lot of researchers at ETS who are thinking about how to measure some more sophisticated and complex skills through advances in digital technology and things like AI. So there's a lot of potential for, I think, exciting work in that area. We're also very interested in documenting opportunity to learn and thinking about how to link information about opportunity to learn with information about learning outcomes. So, you know, year after year, we see reports about, the relatively low percentage of students who are performing at the proficient level on a test like NAEP. We see data on gaps in achievement between different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. But we really need to be collecting the data that will help us better understand the sources of those differences and those low scores so that we can fix them. So connecting opportunity to learn with assessment. And so I really excited that we've been working with the EAD initiative, and on July 13th, which is a ways away, we will be doing a symposium, a half-day symposium with them on measurement of civics, both small scale classroom based as well as large scale kind of monitoring assessments. So mark your calendars for that.
Good stuff. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. And thank you, audience, for being, as usual, awesome participants and asking great questions. Thank you, Laura and Julia, for joining us and presenting today. Really informative, and really appreciated your time today.
So great to be here.
We appreciate it.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.